Hello and welcome to the Arabic Hour. My name is Dima Hakim. The topic of today's program is Lebanon, Modern History and Future Prospects. The special program describes the historical context of Lebanon's social order, leading us to the economic crises the country faces today. Today's guests are Dr. Hani Faris, Dr. Atif Kubursi, and Dr. Bassel Salloukh. Atif Kubursi is Emeritus Professor of Economics at McMaster University. Dr. Kubursi was consultant to many United Nations organizations during his career. Bassel Salloukh is a professor of political science at the Lebanese American University. Dr. Salloukh's research includes an intersectional critique of power-sharing arrangements in post-war states and the philosophy of reconciliation in divided places. Hani Faris is currently a professor of political science at the University of British Columbia. His work focuses on Arab politics, including Lebanese politics specifically. Dr. Faris will be participating and moderating the program. And now, Dr. Faris, over to you.
Thank you, Dima. Today, we're going to discuss Lebanon. I have with me two colleagues, Professor Atif Kubursi of McMaster University in Ontario, Canada. He's a well-known economist, and Professor Bassel Salloukh of the Lebanese American University in Beirut, who is a professor of political science and focuses on political economy. Myself, I'm a political scientist. So you have today an economist, a political scientist, and a political economist. This program will deal with the modern history of Lebanon and its future prospects. The term Lebanon derives from a Semitic word meaning white as milk, in reference to the snow-capped mountains alongside the eastern shores of the Mediterranean. Historically, the term has not been used consistently. It is acquired definite official use with the establishment of the Mutasarrifiyya in 1861. And it basically refers to what we know historically as Mount Lebanon or the Lebanon. Presently, Lebanon starts in the eastern mountains called the Anti-Libanos at the crest and goes all the way west to the shores of the Mediterranean. Lebanon has been distinguished from the other Arab countries in at least two ways. The first is the absence of a preponderant religious identity and the confessional political system based on the principle of representation of religious confessions. This program on Lebanon will focus on the evolution of the Lebanese political system and highlights its salient features. It will then deal with the present crisis engulfing the country. The aim is to examine the likely future of the Lebanese economy and the state. Now, we will be using the terms confession and confessionalism repeatedly in this program, and it might be helpful to start by defining the terms we are using. A confession is a community defined by its religious beliefs. It's a community differentiated from others by a sense of distinctiveness. The community may also have its own certain customs, traditions, memories, and historical experiences. And it may also have additional features such as language, ethnic origin, and association with a geographic area. So confessionalism, on the other hand, is a system, political system, used in multi-sectarian societies in which the religious sect is a political actor, and political structures and institutions reflect the weight of religious communities. It is utilized as the basic principle for the political organization of the state. This sectarian system promotes the use of religious affiliation as a citizen's primary source of identity. So confessionism, or the sectarian political system, has been in existence in Lebanon for the past 150 years, sometimes partially, sometimes wholeheartedly, and overwhelmingly. Now, why was this system introduced? Who introduced it, and how was it introduced? What effect did it have on social stability and social harmony? And what has been its advantages and disadvantages? Bassel and myself will be discussing the origins and evolution of the confessional system. I will deal with the earlier periods of the Emirates and the Mutasarrifiyya, and Bassel will deal with post-independence Lebanon. So in its modern history, Lebanon experienced three consecutive political systems. The first, the Imara, or the Principality. In the Imara, the system was based on a feudal relationships. So it was secular. It was a system made up of two primary elements, the Druze and the Maronites. And a Druze feudal lord may have Maronite subjects in addition to his Druze subjects. So will a Maronite feudal lord who may have Druze subjects in addition to his Maronite subjects. So it was a feudal relationship. This system continued for some 300 years, from the early 16th century to the mid-19th century. It came to a crisis situation in the two decades of 1840s and 1850s. There were violent clashes between the community, which led to a transformation of the system. Now, why did this happen? Several factors, but usually it is a large change in demographic distributions, and second, socioeconomic transformations, and third, foreign interference. In the case of Mount Lebanon in the Emirates, at the mid-19th century, the European powers began to interfere in the internal affairs of Muslim and Christian confessions. Muslims represented by the Druze, and the Christians primarily represented by the Maronites, the Greek Orthodox, and the Greek Catholics. In 1861, a group of five European powers, and the Ottoman Porte, or the highest authority in the Ottoman Empire, met and created a new system for Lebanon. The European powers were five: France, Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, and then the Ottoman Empire. Now, in the system that they developed, they had to deal with two problems, two issues. One was the rise in numbers and in strength and economic power of the Maronite community, and especially its clerical institution, the church. And second, there was an attempt at domination by the Maronite church, hoping to transform the mountain into a Maronite emirate. To deal with these two issues, what they did was not to fuse the various groups in Lebanon and create common citizenship, but rather create a confessional system where each confession has a corporate identity and has its own share of the balance of power and services. And in this sense, they created a strong central executive power, and at the same time, they decided to use the confessional system so that they can divide society and be able to create a balance of power among the various communities. This system continued in existence till about 2014 in the, remember, almost the beginning of the First World War. It came an end at the end of the First World War and the occupation of France of Lebanon. Now here you see again Western foreign interference in Lebanese affairs. In the Mutsarrifiyya system, each power, European power, selected a sect and called itself its benefactor and its guardian. In that sense, France and Austria considered themselves the benefactors of the unions, Christian unions or the Catholics. The Russians considered themselves the benefactors of the Greek Orthodox, and not to be out-positioned, the British considered themselves the guardians of the Druze sect. However, by the during the First World War, or basically by 1916, Britain and France came together and decided to partition the Ottoman Empire territories in the Fertile Crescent area. And what they did, through the Sykes-Picot Agreement, they created two zones, one to be administered by France, which includes Syria and Lebanon, and one to be administered by the British. So when France came to Lebanon and wanted to impose its own colonial rule over Lebanon, it was rejected by most people in the area. It was rejected especially by the Muslims and the non-Maronite Christians in Syria and in Lebanon, who did not wanted independence and did not want to be ruled by a foreign country. In this instance, the French authorities decided on two things. One, to dismember Syria and create several states. And second, to bring in a new entity into existence, which was the state of Greater Lebanon. The state of Greater Lebanon was an area included or covered an area 3 times the size of the Mount Lebanon area. From 3,200 square kilometers, they created now a country of 10,540 square kilometers. And they added to Mount Lebanon the 4 administrative areas of the East Bekaa Valley, and then the principal cities, urban cities of the coast, namely Tripoli, Beirut, and Sidon. Now, in doing so, and declaring a Greater Lebanon in September of 1920, what the French hoped to do is be able to allow for the Maronite allies, for their Maronite allies, a state that they could administer and basically serve their own interests. They did that, but what the reason it didn't work is that now the distribution of confessions was totally different. In the Mutasarrifiyya, Maronites basically represented about 60% of society. In the new entity, the Maronites represented only 30%. It was going to be very, very difficult for 1/3 of the, or less than 1/3 of the population to establish its hegemony over the whole of society. And of course, the system was rejected by the non-Maronites. The problem and the crisis continued in the 20s up to 1936. The opposition of the populations of annexed lands threatened to reject Lebanon as an idea, and began to claim a Syrian identity and wanted to merge with Syria. So French authorities decided then to bring up the traditions of Mount Lebanon and infuse it to the whole system of Greater Lebanon. What they did was introduce the confessional system again, and in 1936, they convinced the Lebanese government to create new institutions, new balance of power, new distributions of authority, and therefore hoping that the communities other than the Maronites will begin gradually to accept the new entity, because now they are benefiting from it, especially their own leaders, their own elites, and begin to merge in this new political entity. Well, it so happened that they succeeded to some extent, and Lebanon as an entity began to gain in legitimacy and to become more accepted by the various entities. But what happened is that in this system, it's a fractionalized system. The power that be, meaning the government of Lebanon, and the mandate power, France, were able to use a system of divide and rule, weaken the different entities, but bring them around to share in the benefits. And this continued until 1943 and the gaining of independence of Lebanon. And I think at this point, Bassel can take over and go over the developments that came post-independence.
Okay, so I'm just going to make a couple of points, if you may allow me, because the narrative seems to suggest a linearity, which was not the case. I think part of this program is to show that there are different perspectives on Lebanese history and politics, and I think that's important. So two important takeaways from the narrative that Hani gave. One is that sectarian identities were not always the most important identities, particularly in Mount Lebanon. And it's really until 1861 and the establishment of the Reglement Organique that you see the establishment of a sectarian order. But even then, I mean, I think what's interesting about that period is that even then there was a struggle, particularly in the Administrative Council of Mount Lebanon, over what kind of vision should this new entity have, whether it should be organized along sectarian lines or non-sectarian lines. And this continues up until the outbreak of the First World War. And for reasons that have to do with the power of the Maronite Church, Maronite lobbying in France, but more importantly, French geopolitical interest, Lebanon was created. So I think it's always very important to make sure that we don't give the Lebanese story a kind of a linear progression. Now, to jump to the post-independence period.
If you allow me just to answer your comment. Yes, of course, I agree with you. And that's the very reason why I said foreign interference was the reason why we had a more fractionalized and confessionalized system. Had the Lebanese been left to their own, probably you would not have gone in that direction. As you said in the Mutasarrifiyya, what the largest community in Mount Lebanon wanted was predominance, not a sectarian system. They felt that it goes against their interests. For the rest, they didn't mind a more equitable distribution of power. So when the Administrative Council of 12 members was created, you know, the affiliations of the members were based on their religious identity, on their sectarian identity. So the foreign powers that administered the Mount Lebanon with the Mutasarrif didn't mind creating the friction, the segmentation, the system of sectarian representation that they did. And that, as I mentioned, also happened in the mandate. Here, France came back to salvage the system it created by creating, again, a sectarian system. So I agree with you. It doesn't mean that everybody's identity was sectarian, but sectarianism became an important, one of the principal identities of Lebanese political life. Go ahead, sorry.
So I think an important point to make is that this kind of new country, Grand Liban and then Greater Lebanon, had to manage politics between people who had, and sometimes communities who had different visions of what this entity is. But it's very important to remember that a lot of the politics in the post-independence period was about really local politics, the politics of the Zama. And in fact, if one goes back and rereads this period, one will notice that the main struggles were actually between the Maronite elites themselves. And it is the case that the Muslim elite always demanded more and more share of power, but actually the main political contest were between either a Maronite Zaim and the Maronite Church, or a Maronite Zaim and another Zaim. The other thing which I think is important to highlight about this period is the contest over the state. What kind of state should Lebanon have? And so the traditional political elite, what we tend to refer to as the Zama, wanted a very weak state that can be manipulated by them, and a state where they can pack their partisans. But there was another vision for what kind of state Lebanon should have, and this was the vision, of course, presented by Fuad Shahab and the people around him, and the attempt to build a state with strong institutions. Now, of course, that contest was lost and was won ultimately by the traditional political elite, and that put us on the slippery slope to civil war.
The political entity that has been created to serve the interest of the French, and this is the element of foreign interference that Hani was talking about, hobbled the economy, defined its character. First, it's going to be a very small economy, and small economies do not benefit from economies of scale, which is the reduction in cost when you have a very long production run, and economies of scope of variety. So what we have was an economy that was disjointed from its region. And that's why the French were very quickly established and pushed for a custom union between Lebanon and Syria. where Syria specialized in commodity producing, agriculture and industry, and Lebanon specialized in the services. This is why when the custom union was dissolved, Syria was left with very large, disproportionate commodity producing sectors, and Lebanon had a large disproportionate services sector. Actually, services in the Lebanese economy constituted about 70% of the total GDP, which was something that only advanced economies who had developed their agriculture industry and transformed it into services. Lebanon went into the services without the industry agriculture. And this had a lot to do with also the confessional structure of the economy. The confessional political structure would not have existed, would not have been sustainable without an economic confessional structure. And how did this economic confessional structure manifest itself? It manifested itself in serving the interest of the dominant sect, which is the Maronites, who have literally monopolized the bureaucracy and the commanding heights of the state. And they had a sort of a golden handshake, so to speak, with the coastal inhabitants of Lebanon, which were primarily Sunni. So it was a little bit of an intersection between the interest of the bureaucrats and the trading families. Now, this is a bit of a generalization. There, of course, are exceptions. But how did this sustain itself? It sustained itself because the government, the bureaucracy, depended on a single source of income, which was a tax on imports. Imports that were, to a great extent, monopolized by the coastal trading families, primarily Sunnis. So there was really a situation where the bureaucracy is sustained primarily by what the Sunni trading families had contributed. But to this, to sustain and to continue, they had to basically operate a system that literally is a laissez-faire system. Actually, laissez-tout-faire, some people think, where private enterprise and freewheeling and dealing became a very defining characteristic of the Lebanese economy. But so much so that what the government was supposed to do is basically to guarantee that freedom of trade would be maintained. And as long as it depended on imports, it was an import bias. It's an economy that depends and is promoting, encouraging, protecting imports. And how do you protect it? Well, by literally building all the infrastructure along the trading routes. Other areas that are outside the trading routes, like Biqa, Hermel, the south, were literally left out. So that bias towards import and the subsequent development of only infrastructure to sustain these imports and to give it that power to basically and fundamentally effect that system through the overvalued exchange rate, it destroyed exports. So the Lebanese economy was never in a position to export. Exports were too expensive because the Lebanese pound is overvalued. And Lebanon became an economy that was successful in exporting its producers rather exporting its product. It's no small wonder that the Lebanese are everywhere, literally because they were literally pushed over because the country did not create the jobs that could absorb these people. It became also a rentier economy. It's no longer a productive economy because everything is coming from outside. 82% of consumption that the Lebanese really have, it comes from imports and not from domestic sources. And this increasingly also dissociated Lebanon from Syria and from its neighboring depth, so to speak. A rentier economy depends on remittances. Lebanon, to a great extent, became a major country in the world with the defining characteristic of being so dependent on these remittances. But to these things, there were really incredibly difficult economic dysfunctions that we are paying for today. It didn't create enough jobs. It did not retain its people. It was a pushover of all its talents to go outside. It is a deformed economy with incredibly advanced services sector, but feeble, weak, and disarticulated agriculture and industry. It also became an economy with that, let's say, to fare, where sources of income became to a great extent hidden. This is really another explanation why in Lebanon the underground economy became such a large economy. And this is also why the system that depended so much on revenues coming from imports, they did not develop alternative sources. The tax system in Lebanon is still now a very weak, deficient system, relying heavily on indirect taxes, where taxes on income and profit are not really substantial, high, or enough to balance the economy. But more importantly, it created a situation where differences in income and wealth increased, exploded. There is a measure in economics called Gini coefficient, which looks at the proportion of families represent how much of total income. About 10% of Lebanese families explain more than 50% of total income. And when it comes to wealth, 10% of the Lebanese families may explain over 70% of the wealth. In some sense, what you really look at the flip side of it, that there are about 90% of the Lebanese really don't have much share in income or wealth.
In some of your writings, you refer to this as the political economy of sectarianism. How did sectarianism, what role did it play in the evolution of this kind of economy?
Yeah, Hani, there is definitely a strong connection between the confessional political structure and the economic structure that evolved. First, confessionalism and trying to give a dominance to the Maronites and carving Lebanon, it carved a polity that is not economically viable because it's too small of an economy. Secondly, it disjointed, deformed the economic structure by Lebanon being primarily service-oriented. The service sector claimed a much larger share of the economy than what the contributions of agriculture and industry. It also made it so much dependent on that one single source of revenue, which is the tariffs, and it literally trying to maintain the interest of the trading families who are supporting the bureaucracy. It meant that it depends so much on imports. The economy was not in a position to sustain and generate jobs. And at the same time, it made a disincentive for the exporters, for people who could have produced and exported. So in some sense, a small economy typically would have a much larger share of exports. In Lebanon, it didn't come through, and the reason for this, because the sectarian system called for, demanded a highly overvalued Lebanese pound that militated against the capacity of the country to export.
Thank you, Atif. Bassel, what about the institutions, political and otherwise, of the sectarian political system in Lebanon? What can you tell us about about the issue of identity in the sectarian system.
So to pick up from Atif, I think one of the problems that this new country faced is the fact that the economy and particularly the finances and the state institutions were dominated by the Maronites. There was a power sharing agreement between the Muslims and the Christians, but everyone could see from independence up until the outbreak of the Civil War that really the most powerful institutions and positions in the state were captured by the Maronites, because after all, they had dreamed of Lebanon, they had lobbied for Lebanon, but also the political economy was also by and large controlled by the Christian. Now the problem with the Lebanese political system, sometimes it's referred to as sectarian, sometimes it's referred to as consociational, is that these kind of systems in divided societies with weak states tend to incentivize only one kind of identity, and that is the religious or sectarian identity. And this is exactly what happened in Lebanon. We have another example in post-2003 Iraq. The problem with these kind of systems, which are not unique to Lebanon or Iraq, you have them in Switzerland, Belgium, Netherlands, and so on. The problem in Lebanon is that when you place such power sharing, consociational power sharing systems in context where the state is very weak, then the politicians will use the state and the resources of the state to mobilize their supporters around sectarian and religious identities. And so what developed is what we call in political science these patron-client relations, where access to the state, access to resources of the state have to pass through the sectarian zaim. With time, this created the kind of immobilism in the political system that placed the country on the slippery slope towards civil war. Because as the Muslim political elite started demanding more and more privileges in the system, and as Lebanon became a site for geopolitical battles, namely the issue concerning the right of the Palestinian commandos to use Lebanon as a staging ground for operations against Israel, the system could not handle these pressures. And it was obvious in the late 60s that the country was about to explode. It's very interesting, anecdotally, to mention that Michael Hudson wrote his book on Lebanon called The Precarious Republic, which was published in '68. And the great Lebanese historian Kamal Salibi liked the book except the title of the book, because he thought that the title was very pessimistic. Lo and behold, the Civil War started in '75. Now, in the post-war period, this sectarian system was simply recycled, now given rise to parity between the Muslims and the Christians. So whereas in the post-war period, most of the important positions in the state were controlled by the Maronites and parliament was divided 6-5. In the post-war period, there is a move towards, with the Taif agreement, there is a move towards parity in the distribution of public offices, and many positions in the state, which were earmarked for the Christians, but particularly for the Maronites, were now shifted to the Muslim sects. Much more importantly, much of the powers of the president, the Maronite president, now have been deposited in cabinet in its collective capacity. But having said this, what we see in the post-war period is really the development of what John Nagel calls zombie power sharing. That is, Lebanon's power sharing system in the post-war period developed into a zombie system, which is dead, but cannot give rise to anything new, and blocks any kind of reforms in the system. Now, concerning the political elite, I think it's very important to say two things. First of all, that the pre-war political elite, the traditional Zama, are qualitatively different in their approach to politics than the post-war political elite and political economic elite, in the sense that local politics to them was very important, and in the sense that they, in large measure, their power was built on traditional bases. And to them, the state was important to control, but they did not obsess about colonizing the state and state institutions with their own partisans. We see a big shift in the post-war period, where now the state is colonized by those who had actually fought the war. After all, they fought the war because they wanted control over the state. And I think we're going to get to this later in this discussion, but a lot of the problems that we are facing today, the financial and economic collapse, can be traced to that period immediately after the end of the Civil War, when a new political elite now looks at the state as a target, and they take it over in a very predatory manner.
There are many economic manifestations, dysfunctions, I would call them, that emanate or have their roots in the confessional system. There are three that we didn't talk about. One you already mentioned, Hani, which is clientelism, which I really believe is a manifestation of the muhasasa, the sharing of government by sects, where the leaders would maintain their grip on their followers by offering goodies, so to speak. It's a sort of a authoritarian bargain Lebanese style, is that you give me your support, your acquiescence, I give you jobs, I give you subsidies, and so on. The other one is that so many of these sects, like the Orthodox, the Shiites, and the Druze, that were left outside that golden handshake between the Sunni traders and the Maronites controlling the bureaucracy, they found their access to survival, economic survival, either through the clientelism or developing their skills, their education. And this was really quite relevant for those who had a different source of income. The Orthodox, they say, really became the major, their share in being professors, engineers, doctors, lawyers, is much larger than their share in population. The reason for this is because they were blocked. They had to find a different source of income and jobs, and because they also lived in areas that had cash crops, the olive oil, like in Kura and others. And that's why no surprise that in AUB, most of the economists that I know had come from there, including yours truly. I mean, to a great extent, this is a manifestation of what's known as bloc minorities that Everett Higgins had written so much about, that people who could not really access the power and benefit from it had to develop alternatives. The other one is the mahrumin, the deprived. It's no small wonder that the Shiites, who populate most of the agrarian agricultural areas in the south and Bikha, were left out of the system. And it created that manifestation of the people who felt they are outside that handshake, outside that framework. And that whole idea of being deprived and being neglected and being outside has shaped much of the modern Lebanon that we know about, and the attempt on the part of those who have been deprived, either through what happened with Imam Sadr, al-Mahrumin, and what he really worked for, are all a manifestation of a confessional economy that served interests of the dominant sex and neglected and turned its back on those who are outside the system. And the other manifestation is that everybody seemed to have had some protection. And that protection somehow shielded and gave rise to corruption and the hidden economy. I mean, in a way, the corruption is basically a fundamental way in which those who are in power or have access to power have used their power to shield, to protect, to turn a blind eye on sources of income that are legitimate, above board in the regular economy. The growth of the parallel economy that is very characteristic of Lebanon. Some believe that up to about 50% of the Lebanese economic incomes are generated outside the regular or the above board economy. So corruption, the subordinate parallel economy are again, to a great extent, related, supported, sustained by the confessional system.
Thank you, Atif. Now that we've discussed questions like the elite and political economy and the issue of socio-economic differences and how sectarianism affects them, I'd like to turn to the issues of how the system propagates itself. How come this system has been going on in part or in whole for 150 years and still goes on? And I'm referring in this instance to three issues, which I feel three fields that propagate this confessional system. The first is the political, and you and Bassel have discussed it. The second is legal, and the third is educational. I'd like to touch on the last two areas. On the legal, it is the issue of personal status law in Lebanon. It's an issue which many Lebanese modernists have tried to delete or have it revised and have been unable to do so. What is this system? In Lebanon, you have 18 different confessions recognized by law. And in Lebanon, each sect enjoys in matters of personal status exclusive prerogatives, so that it has its own court system and its own laws. And the state is obligated to implement the laws, the decrees issued by the court systems of the sects. So every Lebanese, in essence, must have a sectarian identity because he has to belong to a community, to a confession. And given the number of confessions, the variations in the laws that exist on personal status are staggering. They are different, there are all kinds of laws, and a Lebanese has no commonality with other Lebanese when it comes to personal status. By personal status, we are referring to things like marriage, divorce, adoption, inheritance, and other things. Although in 1936, there was a legislative decree that said the state must evolve a civil code on personal status, that was never done. So we've had 8 decades of Lebanese political life where on this legal issue, which propagates differences among citizens and propagates the sectarian system, we're unable to touch. In my own field research in Lebanon in the late 60s, early 70s, what I found out that this is not the exclusive design of one of the sects. Actually, all the sects, it seems to me, through their clerical institutions, are insistent of maintaining this system, which is quite corrupt. This is a propagation of differences and peculiarities among citizens. The other issue is the issue of education, the education system. Now, some noted writer has said, all national educational systems indoctrinate coming generations with the basic outlooks and values of their political order. And Lebanon is not an extension. The system we have in Lebanon is peculiar, needs to be studied to understand how it contributes to the perpetuation of sectarianism. It's a system that has spread education, no doubt. Almost 99% of the youth in Lebanon are educated. About 95% of adults have an education. These are high numbers, and they're among the better ones in the whole region. However, what's peculiar about the Lebanese education system is that, one, it divides into two main areas, public and private. And private has been dominant throughout the 19th and the private education system has been dominant throughout the 19th and 20th century. In the 19th century, you basically had nothing called public education. You only had private education. And this private education was either the work of clerical institutions, churches, who took upon themselves to educate their youth, or missionaries, foreign missionaries. In the 20th century, we didn't see public education till later in the mandate system. And this public education system has certain restrictions placed on it. Let me explain why. In Lebanon, 1/3 of the population of Lebanon are in the school system. 1/3 of the total population goes to schools in Lebanon at all levels of education. Of these, about 900,000 go to elementary and secondary schools. Elementary and secondary schools, more than 60% of all students go to private education. Public schools are a recent phenomenon. Until 1950s, the Ministry of Education in Lebanon had as its guidance the maxim that it's only to interfere and introduce public education institutions where private education is failing, where it's not covering the needs that exist. And therefore, public system evolved more because the private system was not able to meet all needs. Now, you will notice that in the private school system for the elementary and secondary students, who count about 900,000 students, these divide in turn into three categories. We have public schools, and we have private schools, and we have no-cost private schools. Generally, there is now in Lebanon the same number of schools that are public as there are private. But as I mentioned, almost 2/3 of the students are in private schools. So although they have public school system financed by government, 2/3 of students go to private schools. The more interesting thing is that for the no-cost schools, private schools, they are primarily more than 95% sectarian-based schools, whether it would be Maronite or Catholic or Orthodox or Armenian or what have you. And the problem with this is that the state finances these schools, and the clerical institutions and leadership have made it clear to the government that because of the economic crisis in Lebanon today, they want them to finance these no-charge schools totally, completely, and maybe get out of the business of having public schools for elementary students. Recently, Secretary General of the Catholic Churches in Lebanon made it a public proposal that the state should get out of elementary education and leave it to the confessions. Now, as you know, each confession teaches the formal educational system approved by the state. But at the same time, it adds to it its own visions, its own value system, its own traditions, and what have you. This is why I say education in Lebanon has become one of the principal mediums for the propagation of a sectarian system.
So it's not only the economy that is...
No, education and law too.
Yeah, and this must contribute to a fragmentation, so to speak. I mean, you sustain the fragmentation. One of the most important things I have really went through is I went to a non-sectarian school. It was the international college that you went to, and Bassel too. We were with all other sects. It literally fashioned, conditioned, generated a situation where our social system was not based on any sectarian things. And this is really, in my view, one of the most important fundamental pillars of a society that wants to rid itself of these dissociative forces. Education became an associative one, reinforces the interaction among different groups. So it is, to a great extent, education is now a mechanism of maintaining, sustaining differences and dissociative, fragmentary forces.
Right. Bassel, do you have any comment on this subject?
No, I think you covered it nicely. It's just, I think between you and Atif, you covered it nicely.
Okay, now we want to go into the more technical issues now, and perhaps the present crisis. As we named it, the three of us, we said it was a perfect storm. And the elements of a perfect storm came together in the past, in the last year, to throw the society as a whole into a major mess. And makes us wonder if Lebanon can maintain its integrity and survive, and be able to deal with the major crises that exist in the ranks of the population or the society. So, can we go and describe this this crisis now? If we can start with the financial and monetary systems, what do you feel happened there, Bassel and Atif, and where are we heading in this direction?
Let me begin by saying that the financial crisis is a logical outcome of all the dysfunctions and problems that Lebanon has sustained for so many years. A small economy, an overvalued exchange rate, a heavy dependence on imports, a society that became a rentier economy, so to speak, a non-productive. The role and the contribution of agriculture industry are quite limited. These were, in the best of times, going to somehow manifest themselves into economic dysfunctions and troubles, and they did. But the financial one has a lot to do also with the war and what the war brought to us and the way we got out of it. The war made Lebanon a smaller economy, I mean, all of a sudden, the sectarian groups, each one controlled a certain area, and instead of Lebanon, which is a small economy, became a smaller economy because areas were separated from each other. Destruction of massive infrastructure. What Lebanese had invested very heavily in creating a modern and a somehow productive infrastructure was dismantled, destroyed many roads, many factories, many, telephone lines, communications, and so on and so forth. But the most important things is the.
If you don't mind, can you give us some idea about within this financial monetary system? What about the national debt?
Yeah,
and
that's
banking sector and the currency?
Yeah,
Can you touch on these things?
Yeah, but I was just coming into it.
Oh, great.
You mentioned it because it's the way we finance the reconstruction. You see, up to 1991, 92, we didn't have any debt, so to speak. All right, but 2000, all of a sudden, year 2000, which is just about 8-9 years, less than a decade after the war, all of a sudden the debt to GDP ratio became over 140%. The debt was larger by about 40% of the total GDP of the country. And before the crisis, that debt became 150, and in the heart of the crisis became 170%. Lebanon was the third most indebted country in the world. And, like second or things is, say, a very productive economy like Japan, but Lebanon is not a productive economy. How on earth was it going to pay for this debt? The real problem here is we finance the debt by assuming more debt. And that's why many people felt that Lebanon had created a Ponzi scheme where you're paying very high interest rate for people to hold your debt, but you're paying them this high interest from their own money. That the economy was not creating sufficient revenues because it's not producing sufficient output to sustain the interest payment and the principal payment. So this debt really became a real drag on the economy. And no sooner the debt that was really mushrooming, ballooning, the word is, it burst. Lebanon was unable anymore to pay the debt, particularly that there was a good portion of the debt that was borrowed in foreign currency. We defaulted on the euro-dollar bonds. We defaulted primarily on the foreign component of the debt. And how do you really pay for the debt in foreign things? If you really have enough exports, which we don't, or you have enough capital inflow, which we had, but then it was being depleted. One of the figures that I like to show is how fast Lebanon lost its foreign reserves. And why did it really lose the foreign reserves? Is for paying this debt and for maintaining the value, the overvalued value of the Lebanese pound. It was set at 1,507. And to maintain this, the central bank had to literally pump a lot of dollars and buy Lebanese pounds, because if it didn't do so, the excess supply of Lebanese pound, excess demand for US dollars or euros would have changed the value of the currency. Sooner or later, the currency had to really fall. It had to depreciate because there wasn't enough dollars. If you look at the graph of the foreign reserves, you'll find out that at one time, we really had around $60 billion of US dollars, and in the tune of a year, we lost more than half of them. And that is by itself a situation that meant that the Lebanese pound could not be protected at a level of 1,507, and then it had to float under duress. And that's why today in the black market, the Lebanese pound is about 20% of what is value under the fixed exchange rate regime. And to this, there are lots of consequences. Cost of living in Lebanon is very sensitive to the value of the exchange rate. Because if our imports now would cost 4 or 5 times more, they will automatically reflect this in the cost of living for the people. Their cost of living is rising very fast and precipitously. Incomes in Lebanon are not changing as fast. Actually, the incomes of the middle class completely wiped out, so to speak. It lost 80% of their purchasing power. And this really means that, lots of Lebanese have been pushed into the ranks of the poor. At one time, poverty in Lebanon was less than 20%. Some now really think it's around 50 or even higher. Some people think it could easily be 60%. There is no new data coming. The oldest data on this, which is the most recent for us, is saying that it's 50%. At the same time, like Lebanon was hit by a financial crisis, people cannot go and access their money in the banks. They're worried, the banks and the central bank, that if everybody went to the banks trying to recover their money, the banking system would fail. No bank is really, viable, sustainable, because it works on borrowing from you and lending it to others. At any time, the banks don't keep more than 10% reserves at most against the deposits. The worry with the central bank is that if we really let the people access their funds and they're being so uncertain, they will raid the banks and banks would fail. And the bank failure would be a major catastrophic thing. Lebanon was really finding itself in a very advantageous position compared to its neighbors. It used to have a very resilient banking system, a banking system that was so resilient that a 15-year war did not shake it up. And what was really so crucial about being so sustainable and so resilient is that it has been able to attract a huge amount of dollars and foreign currency and foreign deposits, whether it is from neighboring countries, from Syria, from Iraq, from Jordan. Anybody who really were worried about the amount of money and wealth they have, they came and hid it in Lebanon, because they also had the bank secrecy law that supposedly was to protect the currency into numbered accounts and without any identification of who owns what. So story is that now, Lebanon that had deposits about 3 to 4 times of its domestic product. Yeah, the debt is 140, 160, and now 170%. But at one time, the deposits to GDP, which in most countries is no more than, say, 40 or 50% at most, in Lebanon was 300%. So the capacity now of the banking system in Lebanon to attract people to deposit, whether Lebanese in diaspora or foreigners or even Lebanese, is shaken. That is one of the most difficult and most problematic problems. The story is now, how could you deny people their savings that they deposited in Lebanese banks and now cannot access it?
Atif, can we talk a bit about the origins of the debt? Because I think it's very important to talk about that.
The origin of this and what really is problematic are 4 things. First is the debt, right? I mean, you really have to pay the debt. And what really happened is that when Lebanon could not encourage or find or persuade or seduce people to hold government debt of Lebanon, the banks came in buying this debt. So it was a very incestual relationship where the banks were getting deposits in dollars, change it into Lebanese pounds, and lend it to the government and get 30, and at one time even 40%, but very high rate of interest. All right? So now what really happened is that the government is itself in a position not to pay its debt. So the banks now are caught lending the government and unable to recover the loans that they have given to the government. So
if I may just add to this, because I think it's very interesting. First of all, I think it's important to highlight that the origins of the debt is government spending. Yeah. And government spending because the post-war political elite turned the public sector into a archipelago of clientelistic networks for their partisans. Yeah. And also used the label of reconstruction and reconciliation as a way to make money. And so I think it's very important to zero in on this point, that it is the post-war political elite that broke the state and created this pact between the central bank and the big banks, whereby they had to buy into and cover the government debt.
Yeah, but
of course, there is the famous incident of central bank governor Edmond Naim, who, when he refused to finance the debt, he was attacked in the central bank. That I think is very important. And then once the debt,
one element, technical element. You're absolutely right, Bassel, is that how does the debt grow? It grows by government deficit. What is government deficit? Is the shortfall of revenues to finance all the expenditures. There's only one technical issue here, and it's very fundamental. If you look at the government expenditures and the revenues, actually, there is a primary surplus. If you look at taxes minus government expenditures on programs, the difference between the two is that revenues are higher. Where did the problem come? It came from the interest payment. It came from financing the debt. That was so high, the negative was so high, and this had to be financed. And it was financed not by increasing taxes or reducing expenditures. It came financed by assuming more debt. And this is the mushroom or the ballooning of the debt problem. So we have to make very distinct things between what is the government expenditures that's feeding the debt. It's not the expenditures of programs. It is really the interest and the things that, except there is one more thing. There is really here an issue that is now becoming flagrant, and this is the fact that there are lots of expenditures that have been spent by the government that have not really been spent on the programs they were supposed to. There were billions of dollars.
Corruption.
Yeah, it's the corruption. This is the corruption. $4 billion, say, to build 5 universities in the different muhafazat, in the different government. The money is spent, but there is no university. Money has been spent on buying really the land for the Arab autostrad. The property is in the name of politicians instead in the name of government. No, I mean, there is no question about it, that part of this financial crisis is this unmanaged government expenditure things, particularly the corruption and particularly this financing the debt by assuming more debt. And equally troublesome here is the fact that lots of people seem to have been able to escape with their money to foreign banks. Many say that almost about 60 to 70 billion dollars have left Lebanon after they really put the imposition on people not able to access their funds. There is going to be some real forensic accounting. The French plan calls for a forensic, auditing. Any auditor worth their salt should be able to tell you where did this money go, who has been able and successful to take their money when the populace in general is not able to. There is really here some very fundamental questions. One of the major things that is needed here is that, all right, you want to have capital control, because if you don't have capital control, they will be run up on banks. Banks will become bankrupt. You want to protect the banking system. It's a very important economic pillar. But hey, wait a minute, let's have it orderly. Let's have a law passed by the parliament. The French plan calls for that. There is no law that shows a legal structure and an orderly way of operating capital control, and many people are very unhappy about it.
Thank you, Atif. Let's move to another section now. We've discussed the economy, the finances, the banks, the currency. Let's move into the area of political instability and insecurity and the violence and war that Lebanon experienced in the past few decades, and how this affects the life of Lebanese society. Bassel, can you possibly discuss for us domestic fragmentation and how that has contributed to insecurity and instability? And if possible, if you can move to the Lebanese port, Beirut port explosion of August 4 of this year, and the effects of that on the situation in Lebanon.
Okay, so I think the post-war period, you can divide it into a number of stages. The first stage, of course, is the long Pax Syriana from 1990 till 2005, when Lebanon was, as a result of geopolitical reasons, placed under Syrian control, and Syria imposed a kind of a pro-Syrian political order. Part of this had involved the rise of Rafi al-Hariri. Part of it involved the manufacturing of a pro-Syrian Christian elite. And part of it also involved the destruction of any kind of oppositional politics, particularly the labor movement, which historically in Lebanon were sites for political opposition. It's also during this period that what Atif has been calling the political economy of sectarianism and the post-war political economy took shape. Now, after 2005, after, of course, the assassination of Prime Minister Rafi al-Hariri, Lebanon became again a site for geopolitical contest. And there was an overlapping domestic geopolitical battle over Lebanon. And interestingly, here the fault lines were not necessarily only religious or sectarian. And only when the Arab uprisings created their own geopolitical sites of conflict that the Lebanese arena calmed down a bit. Now we are back to the eye of the storm. This post-war period led, as I discussed earlier, to what we call zombie power sharing, a system that really can no longer represent the Lebanese, does not function, but does not lend itself to reform. And I think all this was captured dramatically in the port explosion. Because what we have discovered is that the port actually is a microcosm of the political economy of corruption in post-war Lebanon. That is, it is a miniature of the post-war anatomy of corruption in post-war Lebanon. And the criminal negligence that was exemplified in the form of the explosion can be magnified to the whole country. Now, the consequences, as you all know, are dire economically, but more importantly, socially. In many ways, for many Lebanese, this is, particularly for the professional middle class, this is really the nail in the coffin. And what we've seen is a whole professional class exiting the country. And this will have incredible consequences for the future of the country. Again, so the explosion in the port demonstrated the failure of the state in Lebanon and the fact that state institutions cannot coordinate with each other and cannot serve the interest of the public. As I said, the most important consequence of the explosion is not just the destruction in the heart of Beirut, but much more importantly, its impact on the Lebanese themselves and the fact that a big chunk of the population has given up on Lebanon. We have to remember this is coming at a time when the country is suffering from overlapping fiscal, monetary, banking, public health crisis. So it's a dramatic representation of the collapse of the country. And the fact that for many Lebanese, this is the end of a certain kind of Lebanon, of a Lebanon they have believed in and they have lived in.
I mean, let me add here some of the economic aspects of this catastrophic explosion. The port serves 80% of Lebanese imports come through it. The other ports, Sidon or Tripoli, are not equipped and not in a position to take over. It also represents the area where most of the food imports are stored. So there was a major loss. Some people believe that over 90% of the stored wheat were completely lost. But more importantly is that the port serves also other Arab countries. Quite a number of products that go to Jordan. You find it easier and cheaper to go through Beirut instead of Aqaba. There are a number of products that go to Iraq that are cheaper to be delivered from Beirut rather than going all the way through the Suez Canal and into the Shatt al-Arab. So to a great extent here, the port of Beirut is a regional port. It's not a national port. It serves the Arab countries. It serves, some of the demands that the Saudis really put. And there are lots of people who really worry that now, with Lebanon's loss, and if it takes more time and more effort and it's not gonna come back on stream, that Lebanon may really lose a lot more than just the function that it really played for Lebanon, that somehow Port of Haifa now, if all this new normalization going in the Gulf and others, people suspect that some of the products that used to come through Lebanon to the Gulf may now be diverted other place. Hopefully not, but there are lots of questions about who is going to benefit most from the destruction of the port in Beirut. It's not only going to be the Lebanese, it's going to be a region. And then Lebanon is going to probably lose its fundamental transshipment role, where it would take these products from the sea and then take them into trucks and into the railroad that connect to other areas in the Gulf. The port is a pillar of the Lebanese economy. created thousands of jobs. Some people have estimated over 4,000 directly. And then if you take directly and indirectly and induce the typical calculation of economic impact, it could be over 10, 12,000 jobs. And Lebanon...
Atif, let's also situate the port in really the political economy of corruption in Lebanon. Because it turns out, now we know this, it turns out the port was functioning fantastically because everybody was benefiting illegally from it. And some of the numbers that we now know, that there is 1 year where the port did not bring in any revenues for the state, which means there are no imports in a country that imports 80% of what it consumes. So I think that is really what shocked the Lebanese when they discovered that this is not a port. This is actually an alternative country that exists, where the political economy of corruption works very nicely because everybody, all of the different political groups benefit.
This is this word, muhassasa, sharing. It's a very obnoxious term. But what happened is that all these sects and all these clusters, all these whales, hitan, have been sucking the juice from the Lebanese economy. And no place is probably, as you're mentioning, Bassel, exemplified like what was happening in the port. Everybody seemed to be benefiting from it. And seems that some of the sectors and areas of profit and benefit have been segmented. Like a group would take care of wheat, another of cars, another of iron and steel. No, you can't, I agree with you totally, talk about the port without situating it within that nexus of corruption and politics and sectarianism.
Well, thank you, Atif, for your discussion. Thank you, Bassel, for the analysis you gave us. I'd like to move to another issue regarding political instability, security, and war. Lately, we have heard several confessional leaders call for Lebanon decreeing its neutrality in the area, in the region. It has caused a lot of problems, but I don't think that the discussion has been placed in the right context. What we usually refer to in terms of relations happening in the Middle East is Game of Nations. The Game of Nations really relates to a book that was written by an American by the name of Miles Copeland in 1969. In his book, Copeland, who was a CIA agent, told us about what he did in the area. He was involved in 1949 in Hosni Zaim's coup d'etat against Shukri al-Khawatli. This was the first military coup. He was involved in the revolution of 1952 in Egypt. He was involved also with the British intelligence and the American intelligence CIA in the removal and coup d'etat against Prime Minister Mossadegh in 1953 in Iran. So he has quite a history, and he wrote this book to explain what he was doing and what his country was doing. And he refers to this Game of Nations as the immorality of power, amorality of power. In the sense that, he says, the superpowers and the major powers are all involved in the politics of the Middle East. It's a very strategic area, geographically, its location, and resources, its oil and gas resources. The major powers would like to put their hands on this resource. And of course, he says in his book, by hook or by crook, America has decided it must have the oil and be able to provide the oil to its allies in Europe and in the Far East. Copeland left the CIA in 1957 and moved to Lebanon. He stayed in Lebanon for a while. He did the odd job for the CIA. At the same time, he was dissatisfied with the CIA. And he explained later in life why he was dissatisfied. He said they didn't topple enough regimes in the area, and they didn't assassinate enough people. The issue is not a question of morality. The issue is not a question of legality. The issue is amoral, and we want this for the American interest. So this game of nations has raged throughout the Cold War. Remember the superpower confrontations in the 50s and 60s and 70s? Well, he was part of it. And this confrontation that's taking place, you need to know, is still going on. It's not come to an end. It's very essential that we in Lebanon understand that whether we like it or not, we're part of the region. And we're going to be touched by whatever happens. So to just chat and say we want to be neutral or what have you, it's not what you want. It's what others are doing. Lebanon's weaknesses, Lebanon's size, Lebanon's sectarian dismemberments and weaknesses allows others to come and interfere in your society. And whether you like it or not, they're going to try and move confessions and what have you towards them. So it's much, much more important for Lebanon, if it's really serious about maintaining its existence and viability, is to have a policy that will cement its national solidarity and strengthen its national resolve. Lebanon would be far better if it moves on this axis rather than sit and scream, we are neutral, we are neutral. The last section we'd like to discuss is the role of reforms, whether it's an imperative, it is a necessity, or just a luxury. What are we dealing with here? Is it possible to handle the economic collapse, financial crisis, the bank problem without going discussion of the steps that are needed for reform in the system? I'd like to call on my colleagues, Bassel and Atif, and I'll be involved with them, to discuss the reforms being discussed at present. Before we move to it, I want to emphasize, from my point of view as an academic and a specialist on Lebanon, that the two sectors, the political and the economic, are intertwined. They're not separate. You cannot just go and do a few economic measures or bring in some money and hope to resolve the crisis of Lebanon. Meanwhile, you cannot just enter a slight reform in terms of politics and hope to solve the economic issues. The two are intertwined. As can be suggested, take, for example, someone who transgresses or violates basic laws in Lebanon, or laws that have to do with security. And you take him to court, if there isn't a reform of the court system, he will not be punished and he will not meet his right punishment. Similarly, to have an honest judge take on decisions, he has to know that the political system is itself reformed and request that he applies the law, not his own whims or be moved by his connections. So on this issue, can we, Bassel, discuss the October 2019 popular insurrection that happened in Lebanon and continued for quite a while? What significance does it have? How important is it? And do you think it will be able to get some of its programs implemented?
Well, I think the most important thing about the October 2019 protest is that it showed dramatically the failure of the system, the failure of the political system and the economic system, and the importance of accountability, some kind of accountability, and the fact that albeit Lebanese have been accustomed in the post 2005 period to live in a kind of a state of where the law is not important, there is a return to this idea of the state and what the state should do. Now, the problem with the October protest is that they lacked the political organization that would have allowed for this mass of people to translate their demands into actual policies and to fight for these policies. And I think this has to do with the fact that those institutions that usually spearhead opposition in these situations, particularly, say, the labor unions, the professional syndicates, were colonized by the sectarian elite. And that's why we did not see any movement by the labor unions and the professional syndicates. In fact, what we're seeing now is a rebellion inside the syndicates by alternative syndicates, and in places like universities, independent, anti-sectarian student clubs are trying to compete. If you compare this with Tunisia and Sudan, you realize immediately the importance of labor unions and professional syndicates in any kind of oppositional politics. So what we have in Lebanon, we have a game inside the political system, which is an attempt by members of the sectarian political system to consolidate their position. But we also have the emergence of a completely anti-sectarian community that is saying this whole sectarian system does not work anymore and I want out of it. The problem is that you don't have the political organization that can convert this will into actual policies and objectives. It will take time. And I think it has to do with the way in which the sectarian system destroyed any kind of oppositional politics. But the main lesson of October is that there is a big chunk of the population that does not believe anymore in the validity of the sectarian system.
It is an excellent, really, point to emphasize, and hopefully, one time and with some luck, we will be able to unravel this stranglehold on the economy and the political system by these corrupt sectarian elites. You see, I have a bit of an issue with what reform is all about. And I think Hani has put an excellent introduction by saying that it's not economics or politics, it's political economy. Actually, there is a song that said, economics without politics has no fruits. Nobody would take it to the place where power can change. And politics without economics has no roots. That doesn't have really the validity. But there is something really a little bit more profound here. What do we mean by reform? I mean, typically reform, some people think, is that some system is not working. Right? What's our conception of that system? Is it a set of mechanism, gear work? Maybe one single cog did not work, one single arm is bent. I mean, if we think of it as a set of mechanisms, it's very easy to reform it. All you really have to do is to take out that decrepit or depreciated piece of equipment or pulley or generator and replace it. There's other people who really think the system is more as an organism, and you're not going to be able to reform it without having to contend with the forces that brought it and are benefiting from it and will die to keep it. And that in this sense, the reform issue is a lot more complex, because you're not changing a mechanism, you're changing the system altogether. You have to think of it as another organism that has a complete different setup and mechanism, loops, and is able to survive. The Lebanese economic political system, as it stands now in its dying days, is probably a great opportunity to think of how can we rework the introduction of a new mechanism that works harmoniously and can deliver the objectives that we all want of an economic and a political system. All right, let me say I'm optimistic in some sense. I refuse to be pessimistic. Some people say, well, Lebanon is on the brink of an abyss that is going. I don't buy these things. I think Lebanon has proved its resilience throughout history, even its name, as the, from the Phoenicians that really resurrected itself from its ashes. But the story is the following. Why I am optimistic? First, I have never seen the Lebanese economy as Lebanon's economy. I always seen it as Lebanese economy. And Lebanese are not in Lebanon, they're all over the world. There may be 12, 13, 14, 15 million. Some people have told me that in Brazil, there are about 9 million Lebanese there. So if you think of the Lebanon economy as the economy of the Lebanese have lots of wealth, talent, and experience, expertise all around the world. If we only know how to tap into it, how to bring them. The trouble is at this time, we are bleeding. I just read something that 400 professional doctors have left Lebanon in the past 2-3 months. So the story is, if we can really recreate the Lebanese economy and never think of reforming Lebanon's economy, but the Lebanese economy, to get back the Lebanese to invest in Lebanon, to stay in Lebanon, to bring their talents and experience back. I think also there is an issue here. Yes, it's a financial crisis. It's not an economic crisis in the sense that the finances could be reordered. If it's issue only of dollars not being there, maybe one way we can borrow it. Apparently, yesterday, the latest statistic is there are about $10 billion stashed in homes. People are hiding their dollars. The story is, how can we restore confidence and the trust? And these two components are not just economics, they're social, they're political, there are so many things. We need a different mindset operating mechanism that restores trust and restores confidence in ourselves and our ability to do things.
If I can interrupt you, because we have to move on. Now, Atif, there's no game available to the Lebanese now, except the French proposals for reform, which all segments in the population have accepted. What do you think is the chance of implementing the reforms the French have proposed. And I would like to ask Bassel, if possible, other than the economic side, what about their proposals for an electoral law, a new electoral law, and new national elections? Do you think that is feasible now in Lebanon? Do you want Atif to start with the economic proposals?
I mean, one thing you said, which is correct in some sense, although I don't feel quite sympathetic to it, but on a practical level, it's the only game in town. I mean, the French have put together a coherent plan. It has like 4 strands, you know. The first one, you know, that you have to deal with the humanitarian situation and the pandemic, and this should take a priority. But then they went and didn't stop there, and they wanted really to do things. They don't want the humanitarian aid to be going through the government. They want a transparent mechanism that will govern the way this aid is brought and used. But more importantly are the practical things. They want the rehabilitation, immediate rehabilitation of the Beirut port. They want an independent international tribunal that would look into what happened, why it happened. And then they have some very important practical steps, some of which I don't agree with, but they want the resumption of the negotiations with the International Monetary Fund. And they want the Monetary Fund to sanctify the plan and the accounting in a way that would then trigger the reinvigoration of the Sadr, of the international community coming to the help of Lebanon. They want very specific and to the point electricity sector reform. They want to appoint officials would have authority and have a framework within the law 2002-462 without amendments, which will provide this authority with the actual resources to carry out its duties. They are very specific things. They want really tenders that would really bring a gas-powered things. They want, abandoning the Sil'ata thing as something that is not really feasible or consistent with the transparency they want. They want really a judicial review of where the money went. Like people are not going to put money in Lebanon. And if the issue is not an economic crisis, it's basically a financial crisis, how can we bring the finances? And they say that nobody is willing to put a penny in Lebanon unless there is a forensic accounting of where the money disappeared, who is responsible for it, how can we bring it back. And they want basically a supreme judicial council that would oversee the financial review. These are really some very important things. They want public finance reform. They want really a system where there will be public procurement that is transparent and above board. They want basically and fundamentally a tax system that can generate support and a system that would really eliminate all this bloated bureaucracy that has mushroomed. And then the fourth election. But let me say, I like, a number of these. I don't think these would work. And let me tell you why. One thing is that the primary strategy of an IMF package of reform is predicated almost exclusively on an austerity plan. I don't think you can draw blood from a stone. Lebanon has been in an austere economic crisis, and austerity is not the way out. The record of the SAP, which is this structural adjustment package, that is the hallmark of an IMF reform, has not proven its worth in a number of countries. In Africa, it was a dismal failure. I mean, it became the butt of jokes of people like Nyerere or Kawanda. They're saying that if an IMF reform group coming to Nigeria and instead it lands in Zambia, it would not change a word in its reform plan, which means that the package is ideological, it's not practical, it's not really going to work because it's not adjusted to the cases. It seems to be motivated by highly, susceptible or suspected packages of ideologies. I think there are easy way out. Okay, let me give 5 quick things.
Atif, can we leave that for later? Bassel, what's your opinion about the elections and the possibility of having elections before the time it's due and reforming the electoral law?
Well, let me say, well, this is within the French package, but let me say something about the French package. I mean, what the French package is saying, it is saying we want to clean house, that we come in with a meritocratic professional cabinet that cleans house. The problem is you have to do this under the watchful eye of the very political elite that led you to the disaster you are in today.
Absolutely.
And that is the paradox. And I disagree with Atif. I don't think today the IMF it has this blanket approach. I think they're actually sensitive to context. But that's the other irony. Those in Lebanon who want to reform the system and who happen to position themselves on the left are those who are saying we need the IMF because without them we cannot force the political elite to undertake the kind of economic reforms that will undermine their own power. There is an irony here. On the issue of elections, well, it all depends on the electoral law. It's as if you're telling the parliament, which is dominated today by sectarian parties, promulgate a law that will get you out of office. I've not seen this happen before. And I would add to this that most groups who are fighting the sectarian system do not want elections today because they know elections today means that you are forced to play the game that the political elite wants you to play, which is that of clientelism and elections and so on, and that they feel they don't have the political organization to compete with the dominant sectarian parties. So very briefly, it really depends on what kind of electoral law you have.
Okay, I like, the things you mentioned, and I in some sense, I'm really sympathetic to this, but let me say this. I mean, typically my friends tell me, beggars cannot choose. At this time, are there a queue of people waiting to bring money to Lebanon? There is no queue. The only name in town, unfortunately, is the IMF. The only trouble is that they exaggerated. The IMF would not give you more than 4 times your total contributions, which in Lebanon is about 900 million. So the maximum they can give under the present structure of IMF packages about $4 billion. $4 billion is really not sufficient, would not do much. But what is the price? The price is that the IMF, I know they have changed a little bit, but not much. They have what I call the ization. The ization principle is like this. You have to downsize. All right, what does it mean? It means the bloated bureaucracy of the government has to be
cut down. But where would these people go? Where's the private sector that would absorb these people? I mean, you cut them out, you're going to accentuate the actual high level of unemployment that some people now estimate at over 45%. The other thing is they want to marketize. Well, Lebanon is the most market-oriented economy in the world. As I said, it's not laissez-faire, it's laissez-tout-faire. The third one is they want to depreciate the currency.
because they consider the currency to have militated against really ability of the economy to raise revenue and to pay its debt. Well, my God, the issue of Lebanon now is not depreciate, is to appreciate it a bit. It depreciated too much. All right. The fourth one is they typically talk about, making sure that prices and where incomes and things are reflective of relative scarcity. Again, Lebanon is really something is very crucial here, and people don't seem to appreciate. It's a laissez-faire economy. It's a market-oriented economy, but where the markets are not functioning. I tell you what, there are incredibly powerful groups in every single corner of the Lebanese economy. Imagine, in the cement, the price of cement.
Cartels.
عندهم cartels. And not only cartels, they are really, they call them al-hitan, they are whales, they're eating every small thing. So the story is, are we in a way able, or would the IMF be under the most imaginary and charitable way of compliance, able to break these cartels, these clusters? I doubt.
Atif, you also forgot to mention privatization.
Which one?
Privatization.
Yeah, private. But I call them deization. And it worries me. Look, one thing that's worrying me now is that they're saying, okay, we have all this debt. Yeah, but we are not really poor in Lebanon. The government owns incredible amount of resources. I am really worried about forced privatization. It will be, fire sales. It will be basement-based prices. I'm really worried about it. I mean, that's definitely, it's my privatization is on the top.
We're very close to reaching an end of this program. Just one item, the French have asked for a new covenant, proposed a new covenant. I'd like to make a small comment on this. Since its independence, Lebanon has had 2 covenants, no more. There have been hundreds of proposals and bilateral and trilateral agreements between parties, but never lasted. There have only been 2 covenants. One is the 1943 agreement between Shara al-Khoury, the first president, and Riyad al-Saleh, the first prime minister, and basically had 2 principles. One, that the president is to be a Maronite, the prime minister is to be a Sunni. And the second principle that they agreed to is that in the future, the Christians, especially Maronites, do not ask for foreign interference in Lebanon or make foreign alliances. And for another, the Muslims will not look for unity with Syria and demand that. And based on these 2, Lebanon was able to go on for some time and save the system. The second covenant that we've had is the Taif Accord of 1989. In there, a few items were agreed on, but personally, I believe the one most important item, which was in Taif, was to work towards
deconfessionalization.
Exactly, deconfessionalization of Lebanon. And it said that the president of the republic, with other groups, make a committee and begin to plan for deconfessionalization. And the unfortunate thing is that not a single thing has happened on this plane. To me, if you want a covenant, a new covenant, forget it. You're not going to get the Lebanese factions to sit and agree on fundamental principles. But if you can move towards a deconfessionalization, make the citizen be the most important cornerstone, give them equality of citizenship and equality of obligations, then you're moving on the right side, on the right track. And And if anything to happen on this issue, I wish the French and the Europeans and the primary Lebanese figures move in that direction.
Yeah, I think, Hani, you captured it very nicely, because the sentiment that came out of the October protest, and one of its greatest slogans, is Dawla al-Madani, the civil state, which is the antidote of the sectarian state, and where citizens are respected with inalienable rights, and where those who would like to be treated under sectarian family laws would do so based on their own choice. And so the norm would be that of the civil state and civic citizenship, and not sectarianism.
I agree totally with you, Hani and Bassel. I think the only hope for Lebanon is a civil state. It's when we completely deconfessionalize. And this would not have political rewards. I am arguing that there will be huge economic rewards, because the economy has been hobbled, the economy has been constrained, has been devoured of its vitality by all these fissures and developments and dysfunctions from rentierism, from clientelism, from all these dysfunctions. The vitality of the economy is going to come basically from people feeling that they belong to a country, that their freedom are guaranteed, that the respect is guaranteed, that they are really protected as citizens, not as subjects of a particular sect, and where people feel that there is something important and powerful and invigorating in being together. Living in a peaceful coexistence, reinforcing each other. And when you really have the rule of law, and when you really have the respect of the rights of people, that seems to be now flaunted, and people seeking refuge and protection under the tutelage of a Za'im or a leader of a sect. The liberation of the economy comes from an economy based on production and productivity, not on clientelism, on a underground economy, on being able to escape the country. This is a time where we have been exposed in such a way, our vulnerabilities have really become glaring. We don't have our food that we eat. We don't really weave the clothes we wear. And these are Gibran's words. وَيْلًا لِأُمَّةٍ نَأْكُلُ مِمَّا لَا تَحْصُدُ. Lament a nation that does not eat from what it grows. We have to really move to create jobs, meaningful jobs, respectful jobs, jobs on the basis of merit, not on the basis of loyalty and proximity to somebody in power. I think the Lebanese, and especially the young who have come in droves and have voiced their common desire for a civil society, for a civil state, a civic state, al-muwatana. I think this is the beginning and could be the very best open gate towards a better future for Lebanon.
Thank you, Atif. Thank you, Bassel. Thank you for your contributions. I enjoyed very much our program today, and thank you to Arabic Hour for hosting us, and hope to see you soon.